My own father orchestrated a game so twisted, so utterly dehumanizing, that refusing to rank your mom and siblings from best to worst meant one thing: you were sleeping in the metal shed tonight. Can you even fathom that kind of psychological warfare? Dad, oh, Dad. He'd sit at the head of the table, this smug smile plastered on his face, clutching his stupid clipboard like some sick game show host. Time for rankings, he'd announce, while the rest of us just stared at our plates, dread pooling in our stomachs. He was always exempt, of course. He managed the system. That meant he got to sleep soundly in the master bedroom every single night, while we literally tore each other apart for a scrap of comfort. The rules were simple, brutal, and crystal clear. The top spot? That meant an actual mattress, soft pillows, warm blankets, and your own room with a door that locked. A sanctuary. Second place got the living room couch, third got a sleeping bag on the freezing basement floor. Fourth was the garage, just a thin yoga mat separating you from cold concrete. And dead last? Dead last meant that godforsaken metal shed outside. By the time I was 12, I'd spent countless nights in that shed. Dozens. Every one of us kids had, except for Dad. He was never a player, only the puppet master. One night, when I was 13, my siblings all ranked me last. Why? Because I'd lost a shoe that morning and made them late for school. Petty, right? But the consequences were anything but. I lay there, the metal floor burning cold through the gasoline-soaked blanket. Rain hammered the roof above me like gunshots, and spiders dropped onto my face from the ceiling. Mice scurried over my legs as I shivered until my very bones ached. Dad's rankings didn't just break us, they destroyed us in exactly the way he wanted. My brother, Yusef, was a master of sabotage. He'd hide homework, break things, blame anyone else. He'd even start fights right before dinner to make someone look bad, ensuring their low ranking. Once, he poured sugar in Mom's gas tank. Just so she'd miss work and look irresponsible to Dad. Mom ended up spending 3 nights in that shed while her car was in the shop. She came out defeated, and Yusef slept soundly on the couch. Playing nice was never an option because someone always needed to be the scapegoat to avoid last place. Good grades, finished chores, none of it mattered when the alternative was freezing on a metal floor. Every single dinner became a silent calculation. Who could you sacrifice tonight? Which family member did you love least in that moment? Whose suffering would hurt you the least to cause? My sister, Yasmin, she'd perfected crying on command. She'd sob during dinner, recounting her previous nights in the shed, instantly earning sympathy votes. Yusef, the conniver, would make deals and promises, trading future high rankings for votes right now. Mom, bless her heart, tried to stay neutral. But that just meant everyone ranked her low for not having allies. So she spent more nights in the shed than any of us. After years of this, we barely spoke. Our conversations were hushed negotiations for votes. Family dinner wasn't dinner, it was Dad reading out the rankings while we glared at each other across the table, plotting betrayals and planning revenge. I even kept a notebook, tracking voting patterns, looking for alliances to exploit, or weaknesses to target. Trust between us died a long, slow death. Love followed shortly after. Then, during a week of storms, Yasmin got sick. Her fever was so high she couldn't even sit up straight at dinner. Dad's rule was absolute, no vote meant automatic shed placement. She lay there, shaking and delirious, too weak to even point at names on his list. Rules are rules, Dad said, his voice flat, marking her down for the shed. He carried her out there himself, the rain pouring through the rust holes in the shed roof. By morning, she had pneumonia. She was coughing up blood on that metal floor. Still too sick to vote the next night, that meant another automatic shed placement. I tried sneaking her extra blankets, but Dad caught me. He called it tampering with rankings, and I earned 5 nights in the shed as punishment. 5 nights. I spent those nights listening to my baby sister dying 10 feet away, while Dad, the detached observer, made notes about maintaining system integrity. Mom finally, defied Dad and took Yasmin to the hospital. But by then, something in Yusef had permanently broken. He'd do anything to avoid the shed. Recording conversations for blackmail, putting laxatives in our food before ranking day. He even spread lies about Mom that made Dad scream at her for hours, guaranteeing she'd get sympathy votes from us. The doctors at the hospital asked about Yasmin's frostbitten toes and the rust marks on her skin, but Mom lied. She said Yasmin had been camping. They didn't believe her, but they couldn't prove anything without Yasmin talking, and she hadn't said a word since getting sick. Dad punished Mom with 2 weeks straight in the shed. She came back thinner, quieter, completely defeated. Then, one night, Dad announced a new development in his system. The shed wasn't the bottom anymore. He dug a pit behind it, with just dirt walls and a tarp on top. For whoever ranks last, starting now, he explained, his eyes practically gleaming with excitement. The shed, he said, would be for second to last place. Yusef, my own brother, immediately volunteered to dig it deeper in exchange for immunity from last place for a week. That's when I knew. We were completely lost. My brother was literally digging a grave for his family members to sleep in, just to save himself. Mom had given up entirely, automatically ranking herself last every night with a defeated, empty smile. Yasmin remained too weak to vote properly, guaranteeing her more shed nights. The pit was almost finished. Tonight, someone would sleep in dirt. I stared at the hole behind the shed, dirt walls packed tight, a blue tarp stretched across the top like some kind of twisted camping setup. My stomach twisted into knots as Dad walked out the back door with his clipboard, that sick smile spreading across his face when he saw us all looking. He tapped the clipboard against his palm and announced that tonight marked a special occasion. Someone, he said, gets to be first in the pit. Yasmin sat slumped at the kitchen table inside, barely able to hold her head up. If she couldn't vote again, I knew she'd end up down there in the cold dirt. I made myself a promise right then, right there, I'd take her place, no matter what it cost me. Even if Dad added extra punishment nights, or made up new rules to hurt me worse. The sun was setting, and the temperature was already dropping. Frost started to form on the grass around the pit's edges. Dad called us inside for dinner. We filed in silently, taking our usual spots around the table while he sat at the head, clipboard ready. He was smiling that awful smile again, the one that screamed he was enjoying every second of this. We all stared down at our plates, anything to avoid making eye contact with him, or with each other. Mom spoke first, in this flat, empty voice that sounded like all the life had been sucked out of her, ranking herself last the way she always did now, with that defeated little smile. Yusef leaned over, whispering that he'd rank me second to last if I supported him for the couch. His eyes were cold and calculating, like he was working out some business deal instead of deciding where his family members would sleep tonight. I wanted to punch him, but I knew I needed allies if I was going to keep Yasmin safe. So, I nodded slightly and watched Dad making notes on his clipboard. Yusef started his usual performance, reminding everyone in this falsely cheerful voice how he'd helped with dishes and taken out the trash today. Conveniently, he left out the part where he broke the bathroom faucet this morning and then told Dad I did it. Yasmin tried her crying routine, but she was too weak to make it work. Tears just slid down her pale cheeks without the dramatic sobs that usually got her sympathy votes. She was shaking from fever or cold, or both. I could see her trying so hard to participate, but failing. The whole ritual made me physically sick. But I forced myself to go through the motions anyway, ranking people in my head, calculating who I could sacrifice tonight. Because refusing to vote meant automatic pit placement, and I couldn't help Yasmin if I was the one down there. Dad read through each name slowly, savoring the moment while we called out our rankings one by one. When he finished counting the votes, he looked almost disappointed for a second, then announced that Mom got the pit and Yasmin got the shed. Something about his tone made it clear he was hoping Yasmin would end up in the pit for the big debut, but the numbers worked out differently. I felt this tiny moment of relief until I looked at Mom's face and watched it go completely blank. All expression draining away, like someone had pulled a plug. She didn't protest or argue or even look upset. She just stood up slowly and walked toward the back door like a ghost floating across the room. I wanted to scream that this wasn't normal, that families don't do this to each other, that we should all refuse together and let Dad sleep in his own stupid pit. But the words got stuck in my throat and wouldn't come out. Yusef was already heading for the living room to claim the couch, and Yasmin shuffled toward the back door, coughing wetly into her hand. That night, I lay on my sleeping bag in the basement, and I couldn't stop thinking about the storm week when Yasmin got pneumonia. I could still hear her coughing up blood on the metal shed floor, that awful, wet sound that went on for hours while I shivered through my own punishment nights for trying to sneak her blankets. Dad had called it tampering with rankings and added 5 extra nights to my sentence. Standing there with his clipboard, taking notes about maintaining system integrity, while his daughter was literally dying 10 feet away from him. The memory made my hands shake with rage, and I had to press them flat against the concrete floor to make them stop. Mom was in the pit right now, lying in cold dirt with just a tarp between her and the night sky, and I was down here, safe and warm by comparison. The guilt sat heavy in my chest. But I reminded myself that being in the basement meant I could still help. Still plan. Still figure out how to stop this. I couldn't sleep knowing Mom was out there. So, I snuck over to the tiny basement window and looked out at the backyard. It was almost midnight and getting colder, frost forming thick on the grass around the pit's edges. The tarp sagged slightly in the middle where Mom must be lying underneath, and I could see her shape moving occasionally, trying to find a position that didn't hurt as much. Dad's bedroom light was still on upstairs, and I could see his shadow moving around behind the curtains. Probably reviewing his precious clipboard and making notes about tonight's rankings, planning new ways to torture us tomorrow. He was probably excited about how well the pit was working, already thinking about improvements he could make, or new rules he could add to the system. I pulled out my phone that I'd been hiding in my sleeping bag, wrapped in an old sock so Dad wouldn't find it if he searched down here. I looked at the photos I took weeks ago, Yasmin's frostbitten toes, the skin black and dead at the tips, the rust marks on her back from the shed floor that looked like someone had beaten her. My hand shook as I scrolled through the images. That's when I realized I had to do something bigger than just taking pictures. Something that might actually stop this before someone died in that pit. Even if it meant Dad punished me worse than ever. Even if he added weeks to my shed time or invented some new, horrible consequence. I couldn't let Yasmin end up down there in the dirt. The photos were evidence, but they weren't enough. Not when Dad could smile and charm his way through any conversation, making everyone believe we were just dramatic kids exaggerating normal discipline. The next morning, I waited until I heard the shower running upstairs, then crept into the kitchen where Mom was standing at the sink. I whispered about maybe calling someone for help. A teacher, a neighbor, even the police. Keeping my voice low so Dad wouldn't hear through the bathroom door. Mom grabbed my arm hard enough to leave marks, her fingers digging into my skin. She warned me in this urgent whisper that Dad always found out about everything we did. She said he had ways of knowing, that he checked our phones, read our notebooks, listened to our conversations. Anyone who tried to get outside help just ended up punished worse. Her eyes looked hollow and scared, like all the fight had been beaten out of her years ago. And I realized she'd been broken so completely that she couldn't even imagine escape anymore. She actually believed we were stuck in this system forever. That there was no way out except to survive it one night at a time. At breakfast, Yusuf was practically bouncing in his chair, bragging to Dad about how he'd made the pit 6 inches deeper yesterday afternoon. He held up his hands to show off the blisters on his palms like they were trophies he'd won, going on about how the extra depth would provide better insulation or some garbage like that. Dad actually smiled at him. This genuine, proud father smile I hadn't seen in years. He promised Yusuf immunity from last place for the next week as a reward for his hard work. I felt physically sick watching my brother volunteer to dig what was basically a grave for his own family members, doing it eagerly just to save himself from ending up down there. Yusuf met my eyes across the table. There was no guilt or shame in his expression. Just this cold satisfaction that he'd secured his safety for another week. He'd turned into exactly what Dad wanted him to be. I spent the rest of the morning trying to understand why Dad did this. What he actually got from watching us destroy each other every single night. It wasn't just about control, though that was part of it. He genuinely enjoyed the rankings. I could see it in his face when he read the results. The way his eyes lit up when we had to calculate who we loved least in that moment. He liked the fear in our eyes when we realized we might be going to the pit. The desperate negotiations we made with each other. The way trust between us died years ago and got replaced with survival calculations. He called it system integrity and talked about fairness and rules. But really, it was just cruelty disguised as some kind of reasonable family structure. And he was the only one who never suffered. Never spent a single night cold or scared or hurt. Just slept in his comfortable bed every night while we tore each other apart for the remaining spots. At school the next day, I could barely keep my eyes open during first period. My head nodded forward every few minutes until I jerked awake again. The teacher's voice sounded like it was coming from underwater, and the words on the board blurred together into meaningless shapes. I dug my fingernails into my palm hard enough to leave marks, because falling asleep meant I wouldn't be able to think clearly tonight. And if I couldn't participate in rankings, I got the pit automatically. During math class, I started doing calculations that had nothing to do with the lesson, figuring out how to protect Yasmin tonight. If I could convince Yusuf to rank Mom second to last, and I volunteered for last place myself, at least Yasmin got the couch. It wasn't much protection, but it was something. And keeping her safe was the only thing that still mattered in this destroyed family. The bell rang for lunch, and instead of going to the cafeteria, I headed straight for the bathroom on the second floor that nobody used. I locked myself in the far stall and pulled out my phone with shaking hands. Rolling up my sleeves to photograph the bruises on my arms from 3 nights ago when Dad grabbed me during a ranking argument. The marks had faded to yellow and green, but they were still visible. Proof that this wasn't normal discipline. I took 5 photos from different angles, making sure the bruises showed up clearly in the bathroom's harsh lighting. Then, I opened my voice recorder app and started explaining the system in a low whisper, keeping my voice factual and calm, even though my hands wouldn't stop trembling. I described the shed, the pit, the nightly votes, how Dad exempted himself while forcing us to rank each other. My mouth went dry halfway through, and I had to stop and swallow before continuing, terrified that someone would walk in and hear me, that Dad would somehow find out what I was doing. The whole recording was maybe 90 seconds long, but it felt like hours. When I was done, my heart was pounding so hard I felt sick. I deleted the recording from the recent files list and stuffed my phone back in my pocket. Then, I sat on the toilet lid, trying to calm down enough to go to class. The rest of the school day passed in a blur of exhaustion and planning. I kept thinking about Miss McCann, how she'd always been kind when I'd fallen asleep in her class. The way she looked at me sometimes, like she knew something was wrong. If I could just get her to really listen, maybe she'd help us. I practiced the words in my head during every class, trying to figure out how to explain the shed and pit without sounding crazy or dramatic. It had to sound believable, factual, like I was reporting something that happened, rather than making up stories for attention. By the time the final bell rang, I'd rehearsed it 20 times. And the words almost sounded normal instead of completely insane. After school, I went to the library instead of heading straight home, finding a computer in the back corner where nobody could see my screen. I created a new email account with a random username that had nothing to do with my real name. Then, I uploaded all the photos and audio files to a hidden folder in the cloud. It took forever because the library Wi-Fi was slow, and I kept checking over my shoulder to make sure nobody was watching. Once everything was uploaded, deleted the files from my phone's camera roll and recent items, going through every folder twice to make sure Dad wouldn't find anything if he checked. The hidden cloud folder was password protected, and the password was something Dad would never guess, a line from a book Yasmin used to read before she got too sick to care about stories. I got home right before dinner, and Dad was already at the table with his clipboard. That sick smile on his face, like he was about to host a game show. Mom was setting out plates with mechanical movements, her face blank and empty. Yasmin sat hunched in her chair, coughing into her elbow. And Youssef was watching everyone with calculating eyes. I slid into my seat and immediately leaned toward Youssef, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. I told him I'd rank him high tonight if he helped keep Yasmin off the bottom, promising him the couch if he ranked Mom second to last. His eyes narrowed as he considered the deal, weighing the benefits against the risks. Dad's gaze shifted toward us, and I could see him noticing the whispered conversation. But Youssef gave me a tiny nod of agreement. When the voting started, I ranked Youssef second and myself last. Youssef followed through on our deal. The final results gave Yasmin the couch, Youssef the sleeping bag in the basement, Mom the shed, and me the garage. It felt like a victory for about 30 seconds until I noticed Dad making notes on his clipboard with that cold, calculating expression he gets when he's planning something new. After dinner, Dad stood up and announced a new rule in his calm, reasonable voice. He explained that any collusion or vote trading would result in automatic pit placement for both parties involved. Effective immediately. His eyes were locked on me and Youssef as he spoke, and my stomach dropped as I realized he saw everything. Our whispered deal, the coordinated votes, all of it. He was always one step ahead. Always finding new ways to isolate us from each other and prevent any kind of alliance. My small victory turned to ashes in my mouth as I understood that protecting Yasmin just got infinitely harder. Youssef wouldn't risk helping me again now that Dad had made it a punishable offense. I'd be on my own trying to keep her safe. That night, I lay on the yoga mat in the garage, staring at the ceiling and listening to the sounds of the house settling. The concrete floor was cold through the thin mat, and my back already hurt from the hard surface. I thought about Yasmin getting weaker every day. Mom giving up completely. Youssef turning into a monster just to survive. If I didn't speak up now, someone was going to die in that pit. Maybe Yasmin from another bout of pneumonia. Maybe Mom from the cold and starvation. Maybe even me if Dad decided to make an example. I had to risk outside help no matter what Dad did to punish me, because living with the guilt of staying silent would be worse than any night in the pit. The next morning at school, Miss McCann pulled me aside after I turned in an essay that I could barely remember writing. The words on the page were a mess, sentences trailing off mid-thought, and paragraphs that didn't connect to each other. She held the paper carefully and asked if everything was okay at home, her voice gentle and concerned. I wanted to tell her everything right there in the hallway. I wanted to describe the pit and the shed and the nightly rankings, but the words stuck in my throat like they were glued there. Instead, I just said things were complicated and stressful, giving her enough to worry about without fully explaining. She studied my face for a long moment, and I could see real concern in her eyes. Not just teacher concern, but actual worry about my safety. She didn't push for more details, but asked if I'd be willing to talk more after class tomorrow. I agreed immediately, because I needed an ally, even though I was terrified of what Dad would do if he found out I'd been talking to teachers. Mrs. McCann wrote her email address on a piece of paper and told me I could reach out anytime, even on weekends. And something about her quiet kindness made my eyes burn with tears I refused to let fall. That afternoon, I was in the kitchen doing homework when the phone rang, and Dad answered it in the living room. I could hear his voice shift into that pleasant, concerned father tone he used with outsiders, thanking someone for caring and promising to make sure I got more rest. When he hung up, he walked into the kitchen and just stared at me, his expression cold and full of barely contained rage. I didn't have to ask who called, because I already knew it was Miss McCann, expressing concern about my academic performance and general well-being. Dad didn't say anything, just looked at me with those calculating eyes while I pretended to focus on my homework. But I knew what that look meant. Tonight's ranking was going to be bad, and whatever protection I thought I'd built by documenting evidence just became worthless in the face of Dad's immediate retaliation. At dinner, Dad sat at the head of the table with his clipboard. But this time, he didn't even bother with the normal ranking ceremony. He just announced that I was being moved to the garage as a pre-penalty for involving teachers in family business. Which meant I didn't get to participate in rankings anymore. His voice was calm and reasonable, like he was explaining a simple consequence for bad behavior instead of punishing me for trying to get help. He talked about how teachers needed to stay out of family matters, and how my poor judgment had forced him to take protective measures. Yusuf smirked from across the table, clearly happy that someone else was getting punished, and that he was safe for tonight. Mom wouldn't meet my eyes, just stared at her plate while Dad explained the new arrangement. I realized this was exactly what happened when you tried to reach out. You got punished while everyone else stayed quiet to protect themselves from becoming the next target. The garage floor was cold concrete with just a thin yoga mat, and I knew I'd be there for days, or maybe weeks, depending on how long Dad decided to drag this out. After dinner, I gathered my sleeping bag and pillow, walking past my siblings without saying anything, because there was nothing to say anymore. Yusuf headed to the couch looking satisfied. Mom shuffled toward the shed with her usual defeated expression, and Yasmin coughed her way to the basement. Dad watched me walk to the garage with this small smile, like he'd won something important by isolating me further from any chance of outside help. That night, I lay awake on the yoga mat, the cold seeping through the thin material and into my back. Around 2 a.m., I heard coughing coming from the backyard, wet and painful. Probably Yasmin in the shed, struggling to breathe. Then there was this metallic banging sound, like someone shifting around, trying to find a position that didn't hurt. I pressed my ear against the garage wall, but I couldn't tell if it was Mom in the pit or just the shed settling in the cold. Next door, our neighbor, Fergus, stood at his fence in his bathrobe, listening to the sounds of suffering coming from our property. He was an older man who lived alone and kept odd hours, and I'd seen him out in his yard late at night before. The coughing got worse for a few minutes, then quieter, then started again. The banging continued on and off, irregular and desperate. Fergus stood there for almost 10 minutes just listening, his face troubled in the darkness. I could see him through the small garage window, his silhouette against his porch light. He finally went back inside, but he kept looking back at our yard like he knew something was wrong, but didn't know what to do about it. Early the next morning, before Dad woke up, I snuck out of the garage while it was still dark outside. My hand shook as I tore a page from my school notebook and wrote 3 words, "Please help us," along with our address. The note was vague and desperate, but I was running out of options, and Fergus was the only neighbor close enough to hear what happened at night. I folded the paper twice and crept across our yard to the fence line, then slipped through the gap between the boards into Fergus's property. His mailbox was by his front door, and I shoved the note inside, then ran back before anyone saw me. I didn't know if he'd do anything, or just think I was being dramatic, some kid making up stories for attention. But I had to try something, because Dad had cut off every other path to help. Back in the garage, I lay down and pretended to sleep, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. If Dad found out I contacted Fergus, I didn't know what he'd do, but it would definitely be worse than the garage. That afternoon, there was a knock on our front door, and Dad answered it with his usual charming smile. Fergus stood there holding a small package, making some excuse about how it was delivered to his house by mistake. I hovered in the hallway behind Dad, trying to make eye contact with Fergus without being obvious. They chatted pleasantly about the weather, about how cold it had been getting at night, about normal neighbor things. Dad deflected every subtle question about the family with practiced ease, talking about how busy we all were with school and work. Fergus asked if everyone was feeling okay since he heard some coughing last night, and Dad laughed it off, saying Yasmin had a little cold, but nothing serious. I tried to catch Fergus's eye, but Dad shifted his position to block me from view, still smiling and making small talk. Fergus looked frustrated and uncertain, like he wanted to say more, but didn't know how without being rude or intrusive. After a few more minutes, he left with the package, glancing back at our house with this worried expression. Dad closed the door and turned to look at me, his eyes cold and calculating. I knew he suspected something, even if he didn't have proof yet. At school, Mrs. McKen sat at her desk after class, filing paperwork, her face serious and concerned. She'd been thinking about me all day, about the exhaustion and the essay I wrote about feeling trapped, about my visible anxiety when she mentioned calling home. She opened the mandated reporter form on her computer and started typing, listing specific observations that had worried her over the past few weeks: falling asleep in class multiple times, flinching when touched, difficulty concentrating, references in my writing to sleeping in uncomfortable places. She described how I seemed scared of going home, how I avoided talking about my family, how I looked thinner and more tired every day. It wasn't proof of anything concrete. Nothing she could point to and say, "This is definitely abuse." But it was enough to trigger an investigation. Enough to get someone official to look at our family situation. She submitted the report and sent a copy to the school counselor, then sat back, feeling both relieved and worried about what might happen next. 2 days later, a CPS social worker named Imani Mendez scheduled an unannounced home visit for the following afternoon. She didn't tell our family directly, just coordinated with Miss McCann to confirm the address and best time to find everyone home. I didn't know this was happening yet. I was sitting in class, trying to stay awake, and wondering if my note to Fergus did anything. Mrs. McCann sent me an email during lunch saying she was thinking of me and hoped things got better soon, which felt like a tiny lifeline in the middle of drowning. I read it 3 times on the school library computer, looking for hidden meaning or promises she couldn't actually make. The words were simple and kind, and something about them made my chest hurt, because I wasn't used to adults caring without wanting something in return. I deleted the email immediately, in case Dad checked the school system somehow. But I memorized the words first. The next morning, Dad seemed different. Tense and alert, like he sensed something coming. Maybe he noticed me acting differently. Or maybe he was just paranoid after Fergus's visit and Mrs. McCann's phone call. He spent the morning preparing, moving through the house with cold efficiency. He put boards over the pit to make it look like a garden project, throwing some seed packets on top for decoration. He went to the shed and threw clean blankets over the dirty ones, arranging everything to look normal and temporary instead of like a regular sleeping space. Then he called us all into the kitchen and coached us on what to say if anyone asked questions. Tell them we're a normal family. Tell them the shed is for camping equipment. Tell them we sometimes sleep outside for fun during good weather. Yusef absorbed the instructions eagerly, nodding and asking clarifying questions like he was studying for a test. Mom nodded mechanically, her face blank and obedient. I realized they were all going to lie perfectly, because they were too scared to do anything else. Too broken to imagine that telling the truth might actually help instead of making things worse. When Imani arrived that afternoon with her clipboard and kind smile, we performed exactly as Dad scripted. She was a black woman in her 30s with tired eyes and a gentle voice, and she sat in our living room asking questions while Dad hovered nearby. Yusef enthusiastically described our loving family, even volunteering stories about camping trips that never happened. He talked about family game nights and weekend activities, painting this picture of normal suburban life. Mom spoke in a quiet, controlled voice about normal family stress and teenage drama, explaining that I'd been going through a difficult phase lately. I wanted to scream the truth, wanted to grab Imani and show her the pit and the shed and make her understand what really happened here, but Dad's hand was on my shoulder, heavy and threatening, and the words died in my throat before they could form. I just nodded along with whatever Mom said, my voice small and careful. Imani noticed things anyway, her trained eyes catching details we couldn't hide completely. She saw the way we all deferred to Dad, how we looked to him before answering any question. She noticed how Mom's hand shook slightly when she talked, how she kept smoothing her shirt over and over. She saw the dark circles under my eyes and Yasmin's pale, sickly appearance, the way Yasmin could barely sit up straight on the couch. Imani asked to speak with Yasmin privately and requested permission to schedule a medical evaluation, citing concerns about her visible weight loss and chronic cough. Dad agreed smoothly, playing the concerned father who just wants the best for his daughter. He talked about how worried he'd been, how he'd been meaning to take her to the doctor, but work had been so busy. But I could feel his rage building beneath the performance. I could sense the punishment that was coming once Imani left. His hand tightened on my shoulder just slightly, a warning that only I could feel. After Imani left, Dad moved through the house like a storm, confiscating every phone and device he could find. He searched through our rooms with cold efficiency, opening drawers and checking hiding spots with the thoroughness of someone who'd done this before. He took my diary from under my mattress. Yusef's laptop from his desk, even Mom's old tablet that barely worked anymore. He piled everything on the kitchen table while we watched in silence, then announced that outside contact was now forbidden except for school. And anyone caught talking to teachers, neighbors, or social workers about family business would spend a week straight in the pit. His voice was calm, but his eyes were cold with fury, and we all knew he meant every word. I thought about my hidden phone in the garage insulation, and prayed he didn't find it. Prayed that my one remaining link to the outside world stayed secret. Dad looked at each of us in turn, making sure we understood the new rules, making sure we knew that the consequences for breaking them would be severe. That night, after everyone went to their assigned sleeping spots, I waited until I heard Dad's bedroom door close before sneaking into the garage. My hand shook as I pulled the notebook from where I hid it under my sleeping bag earlier. The notebook was small and worn, filled with months of data, tracking every ranking, every vote, every pattern in Dad's system. I felt along the garage wall until I found a gap in the insulation between the wall studs. The pink fiberglass scratched my fingers as I pushed the notebook deep into the gap, stuffing it as far back as my arm could reach. It wasn't much, but it was evidence that this had been going on for years, showing how Dad manipulated everything while pretending the system was fair. I pulled my hand out and arranged the insulation to look undisturbed, then stepped back to check if anything looked different. The wall looked normal, and I let myself breathe a little easier, knowing Dad couldn't find this one piece of proof. I went back to my yoga mat and lay down, listening to the house settle into its usual nighttime sounds. That's when I heard it through the thin walls. Mom's voice came from Yasmin's room, barely more than a whisper, but I could make out the words. She was talking about maybe taking Yasmin to the clinic tomorrow without telling Dad. And her voice shook, but sounded determined in a way I hadn't heard in months. For just a second, I let myself hope that Mom might actually do something, might finally stand up and protect Yasmin instead of just accepting whatever Dad decided. Then Yasmin coughed in response. That wet, painful cough that had been getting worse for weeks, and she was too weak to even answer Mom's question. I heard Mom's brief spark of courage die in the silence, replaced by quiet crying that she tried to muffle with her pillow. I closed my eyes and forced myself not to cry, too, because crying doesn't change anything, and I needed to stay focused on what I could actually do. The next morning, I was eating cereal at the kitchen table when Dad announced he'd drive Mom and Yasmin to the clinic himself. His voice was cheerful and concerned, playing the caring father role perfectly. Mom's face went blank as she realized he'd heard her whispering last night, that he was taking over her plan before she could act on it. Dad explained that he'd been worried about Yasmin, too, and wanted to make sure she got proper care, completely stealing Mom's idea and making it his own. At the clinic, Dad stayed with them the entire time, sitting right next to Yasmin during the examination. He answered all the doctor's questions before Mom could speak, describing Yasmin's symptoms in careful detail that made him sound attentive and responsible. The doctor prescribed basic cold medicine and told them to come back if the cough didn't improve in a week. Dad thanked the doctor warmly and herded Mom and Yasmin straight back to the car, not giving Mom a single moment alone to say anything different. When they got home, Mom's face was completely blank again. That empty, defeated look that meant she'd given up. She realized escape wasn't possible. That Dad controlled even her small attempts at independence. That there was no way out of his system. At dinner that night, I took a huge risk and slipped my phone into my hoodie pocket before coming to the table. Dad's earlier search missed it because I'd hidden it in the bathroom ceiling tiles, and now it was my only remaining link to the outside world. I positioned the phone carefully in my pocket with the microphone facing out. Then I pressed record as Dad started reading through his clipboard. The audio captured everything in muffled but clear quality. Dad's voice announcing it's time for rankings. The scrape of chairs as we all shifted nervously. His explanations of how the system works and why it's fair. Mom's quiet voice ranking herself last like always. Yusuf's manipulation tactics as he reminded everyone about favors they owed him. The phone picked up all of it. Proof that this was real, that we weren't making it up or being dramatic. My hands sweat under the table, but I kept them still. Terrified Dad would notice the slight bulge in my pocket or hear the faint electronic hum. After Dad finished announcing the rankings, he stood up with barely contained excitement. His eyes actually lit up as he declared the pit was now live for tonight's placement. He described it like he was unveiling some amazing new feature, explaining that storms were coming this week, and the tarp would keep rain out while the dirt walls provided natural insulation. He talked about drainage and temperature regulation. Genuinely proud of his engineering. His enthusiasm for our suffering was so obvious, it made my stomach twist, and I had to look down at my plate to keep from showing my disgust. Dad asked if anyone had questions about the new system, and we all stayed silent, knowing that speaking up just made things worse. Then Yusuf suddenly sat up straighter and pointed at Mom. He accused her of tampering with the voting by trying to signal to Yasmin during the ranking, which was completely made up, but gave him a perfect excuse. Dad's eyes narrowed as he looked at Mom, asking if this was true. Mom shook her head, but her denial was weak and unconvincing because she was too defeated to fight back. Dad seized on Yusuf's accusation immediately, praising him for maintaining system integrity and being vigilant about rule violations. He confirmed that Mom would take the pit tonight as punishment for attempting to manipulate the voting process. I watched my brother sacrifice our mother without any hesitation. selling her out to protect his own ranking. And something inside me broke permanently. The part of me that still believed family meant something, that still hoped we could somehow come together against Dad, just died right there at the dinner table. Yusef wouldn't meet my eyes as Dad wrote Mom's name next to the pit assignment. And I realized my brother was completely lost to Dad's system now. After dinner, I went to the garage and lay down on my yoga mat, listening to the sound of rain starting to fall outside. Each drop hit the roof like a tiny hammer. And I knew Mom was in that pit right now, with only a tarp between her and the storm. The guilt and rage mixed together until I could barely breathe. My chest tight with the weight of knowing I could have ranked her higher, but didn't. But the anger also made my resolve harder and clearer. Tomorrow, I was calling 911 no matter what happened to me afterward. No matter how Dad punished me or what threats he made. Someone had to break the silence, even if it meant Dad punished me until I broke too. Because staying quiet wasn't protecting anyone anymore. I lay there for hours, listening to the rain get heavier, imagining Mom in that dirt hole, getting colder and wetter, and I promised myself that this ends tomorrow. At school the next morning, Mrs. McKim pulled me aside before class starts. She asked directly about the uncomfortable sleeping places I mentioned in my essay last week, her voice gentle but firm. I was so exhausted and scared that the words just came out before I could stop them. I told her about the shed, about how it was metal and cold and full of spiders, about how we took turns sleeping there based on rankings. Mrs. McKim went very still as I talked, her face getting paler with each detail. She asked careful questions about how often this happened and who decided the sleeping arrangements, and I could see her mentally filing a mandated report even as we spoke. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote notes, and when I finished talking, she told me she was going to make sure I got help. By lunch, Mrs. McCann had updated her CPS report with explicit concerns about inadequate shelter and potential hypothermia risk. She included my direct statement about the metal shed, detailed notes about Yasmin's declining health that she'd observed during school pickup, and her observations of our family's fear-based dynamics. The report got flagged as high priority because it involved young children and dangerous living conditions, and CPS assigned it to Amani for immediate follow-up. That afternoon, Amani returned to our house with 2 police officers, their expressions serious and concerned. Dad's performance was absolutely flawless as he invited them inside with a warm smile. He showed them the shed, which he'd filled with camping equipment and clean blankets, making it look like a fun outdoor adventure spot rather than a punishment cell. Dad explained calmly that I'd been telling stories because I was angry about normal discipline, that I had a vivid imagination and sometimes exaggerated to get attention. He suggested I might need counseling for my tendency to dramatize regular family situations. The officers looked uncertain as they compared Dad's reasonable explanations to what they were told to investigate. One officer asked me directly if anyone forced me to sleep outside, and Dad's hand landed on my shoulder, heavy and threatening. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out because I could feel Dad's fingers pressing into my shoulder blade. A silent reminder of what happens if I speak up. The officers exchanged glances and told Dad they'd file a report, but everything seems fine for now. Just make sure proper supervision is maintained. They left with just a warning about keeping better communication with the school, and my heart sank into my stomach as I watched their car pull away. Dad closed the door and turned to look at me, and the pleasant expression dropped from his face like a mask being removed. He didn't yell or scream like I expected, which somehow made everything worse. Dad just stood there looking at me with this calm, cold expression and announced that I'd be sleeping in the pit tonight, regardless of the rankings, as a consequence for lying to authorities. Mom's head snapped up and she opened her mouth to protest. But Dad turned that same cold look on her and she shrank back into her chair without making a sound. I watched this happen and something clicked in my brain about what seeking help actually costs. How the punishment for speaking up is immediate, and everyone else just watches it happen because they're too scared to intervene. Dad didn't need to hit anyone or break things when he could control us with just a look and the threat of that hole in the ground. The rest of dinner passed in complete silence while Dad finished his meal like nothing happened. And I sat there knowing that in a few hours, I'd be climbing down into actual dirt with only a tarp between me and the sky. When dinner ended, Dad dismissed everyone except me and explained very calmly that this was what happened when family business got shared with outsiders. That I brought this on myself by exaggerating normal discipline to teachers who didn't understand how families work. His voice never rose above normal conversation level, but every word landed like a physical blow. That night, I climbed down into the pit, and the reality of it hit me harder than I thought possible. The dirt was cold and damp under my hands, seeping through my clothes immediately and making everything feel wet and heavy. The tarp above me dripped rain through small tears. Cold drops hitting my face and neck in random patterns that I couldn't predict or avoid. The walls were so close I could touch both sides if I stretched my arms out. And the feeling of being trapped made my chest tight and my breathing shallow. I tried to find a position that didn't hurt, but every way I sat or lay down just pressed more cold mud against my skin. Above me, I could hear normal house sounds, footsteps and doors closing. And I knew Dad was up there, getting ready for bed in his warm room with his soft mattress and locked door. Through the fence, I could hear Yasmin coughing in the shed. That wet, painful sound, that meant her lungs still hadn't recovered from the pneumonia. She was only 10 feet away, but it might as well have been miles, because we were both trapped in our separate punishments, suffering alone while Dad slept soundly, knowing his system was working exactly like he designed it to. I spent hours shivering in the mud while rain hammered the tarp above me. And I forced myself to stay calm, even though the walls felt like they were closing in. Spiders crawled across my arms, and I couldn't see them in the darkness, but I felt every leg touching my skin. Something with too many legs ran over my ankle, making me jerk away and hit my elbow on the dirt wall. The cold seeped into my bones until I couldn't stop shaking. But I made myself focus on tomorrow instead of right now, on what I'd do next, and how I'd make someone believe me this time. I thought about Mrs. McCann's concerned face and the way the police looked uncertain, about how Dad's performance was so perfect they couldn't see past it to the truth. My body was freezing and scared, but something in my mind got harder and clearer with each hour in this hole. I will not let Dad win. I will not let him bury me and Yasmin and Mom in his sick system. I will find a way to make someone see what's really happening here. Through the fence, Fergus heard the sounds again, louder this time because the rain had stopped and everything was quiet except for the suffering in our backyard. He stood at his window in his dark house and listened to the wet, painful coughing coming from the shed and softer sounds of distress from somewhere else in the yard. He couldn't see anything because of the fence and the darkness, but he pulled out his phone and started recording, capturing the audio evidence of whatever was happening over there. The recording picked up Yasmin's coughing clearly. Each sound harsh and concerning. And underneath it, there were other noises that might be crying or just someone trying to stay quiet while they're in pain. Fergus didn't know exactly what to do with this recording yet, but something told him to keep it, to save it as evidence of something wrong happening in that house. He recorded for 5 full minutes before the sounds quieted down, then saved the file with the date and timestamp showing it was recorded at 2 o'clock in the morning. The next morning at school, I went to the bathroom before PE class and pulled out a permanent marker from my backpack. My hand shook as I wrote, "We sleep in a pit" on my left forearm in big, clear letters, making sure it was dark enough to be visible and placed where people would see it when we changed for gym. I didn't write anything else. Didn't add explanations or details. Just those 5 words that told the simple truth. In the locker room, other students noticed immediately and started whispering to each other, pointing at my arm and asking what it meant. I didn't elaborate or try to make it sound worse than it was. Just repeated the same thing when people asked, "Sometimes we sleep in a pit in the backyard." That's it. That's the truth. The PE teacher saw it when she was walking through, checking that everyone was dressed for class, and her face went pale as she read the words. She told me to come with her right now and walked me straight to the counselor's office without explaining anything to the other students. I let her lead me there, and I felt both scared and relieved, because at least someone was taking it seriously this time. The school counselor sat me down in her small office and asked very careful questions about what I meant by pit and how often this happened. I stayed calm and factual, describing the dimensions of the hole, about 4 feet deep and maybe 3 feet wide, with dirt walls and a tarp stretched over the top. I explained about the mud and the rain dripping through, and how the walls were close enough to touch both sides at once. I avoided any dramatic language that might make them think I was exaggerating or being emotional. Just stuck to describing the physical reality of what existed in my backyard. The counselor's face got paler with each detail, and she wrote everything down carefully. Then Mrs. McCann came in and interviewed me separately, asking her own questions about the pit and the shed and how the whole ranking system worked. I described it all the same way, factual and specific, giving them measurements and details they could verify. Both their faces showed the exact moment they realized I was telling the literal truth, not speaking in metaphors or acting out for attention. This was real. This was actually happening. Their expressions shifted from concern to horrified. And I knew this time they believed me. Mrs. McCann excused herself and went straight to her office to call Amani, her voice urgent even though she was trying to stay professional. She explicitly named the pit in her update, explaining that I'd now made consistent disclosures across multiple days in different contexts. She emphasized that this wasn't teenage drama or attention-seeking behavior, that I was describing specific, verifiable conditions that posed immediate danger to multiple children. She mentioned the writing on my arm, the interview details, the way I stayed calm and factual instead of emotional or exaggerated. Amani's voice went tight with controlled anger as she realized the previous wellness check completely missed the real situation. That Dad's performance fooled them while actual abuse was happening in the backyard. Mrs. McCann could hear the shift in Amani's tone from professional concern to personal outrage. The sound of someone who knows they failed to protect children and is now determined to fix it. Amani hung up and immediately began coordinating with medical services to get authorization for a full evaluation of Yasmin. She was seriously concerned that the chronic cough and visible decline indicated real neglect that needed medical documentation. She called Dr. Romano at the Children's Hospital and explained the situation, arranging for Yasmin to be brought in for a complete assessment as soon as possible. Amani knew that medical evidence would be harder for Dad to deflect or charm his way out of, that doctors documenting actual physical harm creates a case that courts take seriously. She started building a file with all the reports and evidence, preparing for the possibility of emergency removal if the medical evaluation confirmed what she suspected. Dr. Romano agreed to prioritize the evaluation and asked specific questions about symptoms and duration that Amani answered based on multiple observer reports. When Dad got called by the school about the arm writing and the counselor interview, he came home in a cold rage that made the air feel dangerous. He walked through the door and announced that we were all being pulled from the school, effective immediately. That he wouldn't allow interference in family matters from people who didn't understand proper discipline. He said anyone who tried to visit would be denied access. That he was within his rights to control who spoke to his children and when. The control was slipping from his grasp, and he was tightening his grip in response, making everything more dangerous for all of us. Mom sat frozen at the kitchen table while Dad paced and talked about his rights and privacy and how teachers were overstepping their authority. Yusuf nodded along with everything Dad said, already calculating how to use the situation to his advantage in tonight's rankings. I watched Dad's performance and realized I was running out of time before he completely isolated us from anyone who might help. I knew I had to act fast before Dad made good on his threat to pull us from the school. So, after the final bell, I told Miss McKen I needed to stay late to work on a project, and instead I went to the public library 3 blocks away. I used one of their computers to create a fake email account with a name that didn't connect to me. Then, I set up a cloud storage account using that email. My hands shook as I uploaded all the photos from my phone, the pictures of Yasmin's frostbitten toes and the rust marks on her skin, and the shed from outside. I uploaded the audio files I recorded of dinner rankings and Dad's voice explaining his system. Then I wrote an email to Miss McCann's school address, explaining what each file showed, labeling them clearly so she'd understand the context. It was my last play. Putting all the evidence somewhere Dad couldn't confiscate or destroy, even if he took my phone tonight. I felt both terrified and calm as I hit send, knowing I'd just done something I couldn't take back, but also knowing it was the only option left. The email confirmation popped up. And I logged out of everything, cleared the browser history, and walked out of the library into the afternoon sun, feeling like I'd just set something huge in motion that I couldn't control anymore. I walked home from the library with my phone feeling heavy in my pocket, even though I'd deleted everything from it after sending that email. The sun was setting, and I knew dinner rankings were coming soon. But for once, I wasn't worried about where I'd sleep tonight, because bigger things were in motion now. When I got home, Dad was in his office and didn't notice me slip in through the back door. I went straight to my room and waited for whatever happened next. That evening, after a silent dinner where nobody looked at each other, I was lying on the yoga mat in the garage when Yusuf appeared in the doorway. His face was red and his hands were shaking as he walked toward me. He knew I'd been talking to teachers, and he was scared because my snitching put him at risk, too. He started listing everything I'd done, like he was reading charges in court, talking about the counselor meetings and the arm writing and how I was destroying the family. His voice got louder as he threatened to tell Dad every detail, promising I'd spend weeks in the pit once Dad found out. But then he mentioned the pit, and something broke in his voice. For just a second, his eyes showed pure fear instead of the calculating look he usually had. He was terrified, too, I realized. He'd just been dealing with it by siding with Dad instead of fighting back like me. Before I could say anything, he turned and walked out, leaving me alone in the garage with the smell of gasoline and motor oil. Hours passed, and I couldn't sleep because my mind kept spinning through what might happen tomorrow. Around 2 a.m., I heard a crash from inside the house, followed by Yasmin's scared voice calling for help. I ran inside and found Mom on the kitchen floor. Her body crumpled, like someone had cut her strings. She was breathing, but her eyes were closed, and she wouldn't respond when I shook her shoulder. Yasmin stood in the doorway in her pajamas, coughing and crying at the same time. Dad appeared from upstairs, still half asleep, and started saying something about Mom being dramatic. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I ran out the back door in my bare feet, across the cold grass to Fergus's house. I banged on his door so hard my knuckles hurt, not caring that it was the middle of the night or that I was in my pajamas. When he opened the door, I was crying and begging him to call 911 because Mom needed help and I didn't trust Dad to do it. Fergus took one look at my face and didn't ask questions. He just grabbed his phone and made the call while I stood shivering on his porch. The ambulance arrived in less than 10 minutes, with lights flashing red and blue across the neighborhood. Two EMS workers rushed inside with their equipment while Fergus stayed with me on his porch, his hand on my shoulder. Through the window, I could see them working on Mom while Dad stood nearby talking and gesturing. One of the EMS workers kept looking around the house, noticing things. Our scared faces, Yasmin's pale skin, and the way she couldn't stop coughing. The strange setup visible through the back window where the shed and the tarp-covered pit sat in the yard. She wrote things down on her clipboard between checking Mom's blood pressure and heart rate. Dad tried his usual charming routine, explaining that Mom had been stressed lately and probably just fainted from standing up too fast. But the EMS worker's expression didn't change as she documented Dad's defensive responses and the obvious fear in all our faces. When she was helping Mom onto the stretcher, she made direct eye contact with me, and I saw recognition there. She knew something was very wrong in this house. Less than an hour after the EMS workers left, a car pulled up and Amani got out along with two police officers. She was carrying folders and official-looking papers, and her face was harder than I'd ever seen it. One of the officers stayed by the door while Amani walked straight to Dad and handed him documents. She explained in a calm, professional voice that she had an emergency removal order for Yasmin, based on immediate danger. The order cited medical concerns from Dr. Romano's notes, the documented inadequate shelter that multiple sources had reported, and all the evidence that had been building from my reports and Mrs. McCann's observations and the EMS documentation from tonight. My case is under review, too, she said. But Yasmin is being removed right now. Dad's face went from confused to angry to scared in about 3 seconds. His control was finally cracking as he realized his perfect system was being taken apart by people he couldn't manipulate or charm his way around. Dad started talking fast about his rights as a parent, and false accusations, and how this was government overreach. His voice got louder as he threatened to call his lawyer and sue everyone involved, but the police officers just stood there with their arms crossed, completely unmoved by his performance. Amani's expression stayed hard as granite while she explained exactly what the law allowed her to do in cases of immediate danger to children. She's seen enough cases like this to recognize the signs, she said. And the evidence is too consistent across too many sources to dismiss. Dad can either comply right now or the officers will arrest him for obstruction, and Yasmin will still be removed. His choice. Watching him forced into helplessness made my stomach twist with both fear and satisfaction. For the first time in years, Dad had no power over what happens next. They took Yasmin first, wrapping her in a blanket from the ambulance because she was shivering even though it wasn't that cold. She looked back at me with scared eyes as they helped her into Amani's car. Then Amani told me to pack a bag because I was going to a safe intake facility while they finished their assessment. Mom sat on the couch looking lost and confused while Amani gave her a card for a domestic violence advocate. The drive away from the house felt like I was watching someone else's life happen. I kept staring out the window, expecting Dad to somehow chase us down and drag us back, even though I knew that's not possible with the police there. The city lights blurred past, and Yasmin coughed in the front seat while Amani drove carefully through the empty streets. At the hospital, Dr. Romano examined Yasmin under bright lights that made her skin look even paler. He took photos of her frostbitten toes where the tissue was damaged and discolored. He documented the signs of chronic malnutrition in her weight and the way her ribs showed through her thin pajama top. He listened to her lungs and noted the respiratory issues from all those nights of cold exposure in the shed and the pit. He found bruises in different stages of healing on her arms and legs. Each finding went into his report with medical terminology that made everything sound official and real. This isn't normal discipline, he wrote. This isn't tough parenting. This is systematic neglect and abuse, documented through objective medical evidence. Every line he wrote strengthened the case for keeping us away from Dad permanently. A judge reviewed everything that same night because it was an emergency situation. She read Dr. Romano's medical report and the EMS documentation and all the evidence from my disclosures and Mrs. McCann's observations. She issued a temporary protective order for Yasmin immediately. My case was still pending more investigation because I was older and the immediate medical danger wasn't as clear. Yusef stayed with Dad for now because he was 16 and hadn't made any disclosures about wanting help. That felt wrong, but I was too tired to argue about it. The order said Dad couldn't contact me or Yasmin except through supervised channels approved by the court. Just knowing there was a legal barrier between us and him helped me breathe easier, even though everything still felt uncertain and scary. The emergency shelter processed our intake with forms about medical history and education and family dynamics and trauma symptoms. A woman with kind eyes asked questions and wrote down my answers without judging or seeming shocked. Yasmin and I had to go to different rooms because of space limitations, and that made my chest tight with worry. But a staff member promised I could see her first thing tomorrow morning. Everything felt temporary and uncertain, like we were just waiting for the next bad thing to happen. But at least we weren't in the pit tonight. At least we weren't in the shed listening to rain hammer the metal roof. At least we were somewhere warm with real beds and people who were supposed to keep us safe. The next morning, Amani came back and explained the safety plan in detail. Dad cannot reach us without going through official channels. She said any contact has to be supervised and approved by the court. If he tries to contact us directly, he'll be arrested for violating the protective order. She offered Mom the same protections if she wanted them. Mom sat across from us looking small and scared, caught between her fear of Dad and her fear of losing her home and everything familiar. I could see her struggling with the decision, wanting to leave, but not knowing how to function without Dad's structure telling her what to do every day. Even though that structure was destroying us, it's all she knows anymore. Amani gave her time to think about it and promised to check in again tomorrow. For now, Yasmin and I were safe. For now, that had to be enough. The next morning, a woman from the shelter knocked on my door and explained they had a therapist who worked with kids in situations like mine. I agreed to meet with her, even though the idea of talking to a stranger about the rankings and the pit made my stomach hurt. The therapist was younger than I expected, with kind eyes that didn't push or demand anything from me. She sat across from me in a small office and explained that weekly sessions were available whenever I was ready to talk, that there was no pressure or timeline, that this was my space to use however I needed. It felt strange having someone care about how I was doing without expecting anything back, without ranking me or punishing me for existing. She gave me a card with her contact information and told me the shelter staff could schedule appointments anytime, then let me leave after just 10 minutes because she could see I wasn't ready yet. That afternoon, Miss McCann showed up at the shelter carrying a stack of my schoolwork and 3 books she thought I'd like. Her eyes were wet with tears when she saw me sitting in the common area. She didn't ask for details about what happened or make me relive any of it. Just pulled up a chair and told me she was proud of me for speaking up. She explained that I could return to the school whenever I felt ready, that she'd help me catch up on assignments, that my teachers all knew I was dealing with family stuff and they were being understanding. Having one adult who believed me and fought for me made the whole nightmare feel slightly less lonely, like maybe I wasn't crazy for thinking the rankings were wrong. She stayed for an hour, helping me organize the schoolwork and talking about normal things like upcoming assignments and a book she thought I'd love, treating me like a regular student instead of a victim. 2 days later, my phone rang from a blocked number, and I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Dad's voice came through smooth and calm, using his reasonable tone that always meant he was trying to manipulate someone. He told me this whole situation was just a big misunderstanding. That if I explained to the judge how the system really worked, they'd understand it was fair. That I was being dramatic and ruining the family over normal discipline. My hand started shaking as he talked, his words trying to worm into my brain and make me doubt what I knew was true. Instead of listening or arguing, I hung up and immediately walked to find Amani. My voice shook as I reported the violation, but I did it anyway, explaining about the blocked number and what he said and how he wasn't supposed to contact me at all. Amani's face went hard and she made notes on her tablet, thanking me for reporting it right away and promising this would be documented. For the first time, I felt like I had some power instead of just being a victim of Dad's system, like my voice actually mattered and people would listen. The emergency court hearing happened 3 days later with the judge reviewing everything in a small courtroom that smelled like old wood and cleaning products. Dad's lawyer stood up and argued that this was government overreach, that normal parenting was being treated like a crime, that the protective order was too strict for what amounts to family discipline. The judge listened with a neutral expression, then asked to see Dr. Romano's medical report and the documentation of Dad's phone call violation. She read through the pages slowly, her face getting more serious with each paragraph, then announced she's extending the protective order for another 90 days while the investigation continues. Dad's lawyer objected, but the evidence was too clear to dismiss. Too many reports and medical findings and documented violations piling up into something he couldn't explain away. The judge made it clear that Yasmin and I were legally protected from Dad's control for now, that any further contact violations would result in immediate arrest. Mom finally agreed to meet with the domestic violence advocate at the shelter, sitting in a private office with her hands twisted together in her lap. The advocate was patient and gentle, walking Mom through separation paperwork and explaining her options for housing assistance and legal support. Mom's hand shook as she signed the forms, her signature wobbly and uncertain, changing everything about her life with each page. She was scared about money and where she'd live and how she'd survive without Dad telling her what to do every day, even though his control was destroying all of us. The advocate listed resources and support groups and programs that could help. But I could see Mom struggling to believe any of it was real. It was hard watching her realize how trapped she's been, how the rankings killed her ability to imagine any path forward without Dad's system. That same day, I got a text from Yusef that started hostile and angry, calling me a snitch and blaming me for destroying the family. He listed all the ways I'd ruined everything. How I should have just followed the rules. How now he's stuck alone with Dad and it's all my fault. But then the tone shifted, and his next message admitted he was scared living in the house with just Dad now that the system was falling apart. He asked if I thought he could join us in foster care, if there was a way out for him, too. His words uncertain and almost vulnerable. I stared at the messages, not knowing how to respond because part of me was still mad at him for all the sabotage and the way he dug the pit deeper just to save himself. But I also recognized he's a victim too, just one who chose survival through helping Dad instead of fighting back like I did. I texted back that I didn't know what was possible, but he should talk to Amani, giving him her contact information, even though I wasn't sure I'd forgiven him yet. Amani called me into her office the next morning to explain that she'd been working with Fergus to arrange something called fictive kin placement, which meant I could stay with him instead of going to a regular foster home while the case was investigated. She explained that fictive kin is for people who aren't related by blood but have an existing relationship with the family, and Fergus had agreed to be considered after everything he witnessed. Fergus told Amani he'd been worried about us for months and wished he'd acted sooner, that he had a spare bedroom and wanted to help if the placement got approved. The arrangement still needed background checks and home inspections and official approval. But having a familiar option instead of strangers felt like an unexpected gift. 2 weeks later, after all the checks cleared, Fergus picked me up from the shelter with my few belongings in a plastic bag. He drove us to his house next door to where I used to live, but I didn't look at Dad's place as we pulled into the driveway. Inside, Fergus showed me a small bedroom he set up with simple furniture and clean sheets, explaining his house rules in a quiet voice: be respectful of the space. Help with basic chores like dishes and trash. Keep up with schoolwork. And talk to him if I needed anything. He wasn't trying to be a replacement parent or act like everything was fine, just offering steady support while things got sorted out. That night, I lay in an actual bed with soft blankets and a door that locked from the inside. And I cried for an hour from the pure relief of feeling safe. The mattress was comfortable and the room was warm, and nobody was going to announce rankings or send me to the shed or the pit. My body didn't know how to process that level of safety after years of the system. Dr. Romano scheduled a meeting with me and Amani to outline Yasmin's care plan going forward. He explained she needed continued treatment for the breathing problems from the pneumonia, physical therapy to help with the frostbite damage to her toes, and regular checkups to make sure she was gaining weight properly. The healing would be slow and some effects might be permanent, which is scary to hear, but at least now she's getting real medical attention instead of being left to suffer in a metal shed. He gave us a schedule of appointments and prescriptions and therapy sessions, making Yasmin's recovery feel organized and possible instead of hopeless. When I returned to the school 2 weeks later, everything felt both familiar and completely different. Miss McKin welcomed me back with a warm smile and gave me time to catch up on missed work without pressure. For her next essay assignment about personal growth, I wrote about the power of silence. Not describing the pit or the rankings directly, but exploring how keeping quiet protects people who hurt others. I wrote about how speaking up, even when you're scared of what might happen, is the only way to break cycles of abuse and control. My voice felt stronger on the page than it ever did at Dad's dinner table. Each word chosen carefully to express what I've learned. Writing the truth without fear of punishment felt like taking back something Dad stole from me. Like proving that his system didn't completely destroy my ability to think and feel and resist. A week later, Amani called to tell me they'd scheduled a case plan meeting for next month where they'll interview Dad separately and figure out what happens next with family reunification or keeping us apart permanently. The not knowing is hard, because nothing is actually solved yet. Yusef is still living with Dad. Mom hasn't decided if she's really leaving for good, and the legal stuff moves so slowly. It feels like nothing is changing. I want everything fixed right now. I want guarantees that we're safe forever. But Amani reminded me that progress doesn't always happen in a straight line. She says safety comes in stages, not all at once, and that I've already done the hardest part by speaking up in the first place. Her words helped a little, but I still feel stuck in this weird in-between place where I'm safe. But my family isn't completely free yet. Tonight, I'm lying in a real bed at Fergus's house, warm and safe under an actual blanket, and the strangeness of it almost hurts. I keep waiting for Dad to announce rankings, for Yusef to sabotage me, for the expected punishment that always came before. But it doesn't come. The house is quiet except for Fergus watching TV downstairs. And I realize this is what normal feels like. Boring, peaceful, without constant fear. My body doesn't know how to relax because for years it was always ready for the next bad thing. Always calculating who to sacrifice. Always preparing for cold metal or dirt walls. Now there's just soft pillows and warm blankets and nobody is going to hurt me tonight. I don't know what happens next with the investigation or the court case or whether Mom will finally leave Dad for good. But I know I'll keep telling the truth no matter how long it takes, because silence is what allowed the pit to exist in the first place. And I'm done being quiet. Call to action asterisk this whole journey has made me realize the incredible power of a single voice. Have you ever been in a situation where speaking up felt impossible, but you knew deep down it was the only way? What would you have done if your family's safety depended on you breaking the silence? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to hear your perspective.